During a brutal snowstorm in a forgotten rural town, a quiet black doctor climbs onto his roof to fix a broken panel, just trying to protect his daughter from the cold. But when a freezing child stumbles into his yard, begging for help to save his injured mother, the doctor faces a deadly choice: stay safe or charge into the blizzard. What he doesn't know is that saving her will change his entire life and uncover a past the world tried to erase. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The wind had a sharp edge that morning, slicing through the naked branches of the trees like invisible knives. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow, and the town of Pine Hollow braced itself in silence. Most homes here were modest, some barely standing. Paint peeled from siding, roofs sagged under old damage. It was the kind of place folks passed through, not toward. Perched atop one of those weary houses, Dr. Elijah Brooks adjusted a sheet of warped tin beneath his thick, calloused hands. His breath came out in faint white clouds, steady, controlled, despite the biting cold that gnawed at his bones. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the creases around his eyes carved deeper by time and pain than by age. His skin, the color of deep mahogany, glistened faintly with sweat beneath a knit cap that had long lost its shape. A man who used to wear surgical gloves now wore work gloves with holes in the thumbs. He hammered down a nail with practiced force, lips pressed tight, not out of frustration but focus. Every blow was an act of protection. This roof was the last barrier between his daughter and the storm that crept over the horizon. The radio had warned of the blizzard all week, but here, where people had to choose between heating bills and groceries, preparing for a storm meant mending what you could with what you had. A sudden movement below caught his eye. At the end of the snow-dusted street, a small figure stumbled out from between two run-down garages. A boy, maybe 6, maybe 7, wearing no hat, coat open, shoes soaked dark with snow. His steps were uneven, urgent, like someone running from a dream that hadn't let go yet. Elijah squinted, lowered the hammer, and leaned out over the eave. The child tripped and landed hard on one knee, then pushed himself up again with trembling hands. Elijah's breath caught. This wasn't just a kid wandering home. Something was wrong. He climbed down the ladder, fast but careful, landing with a dull thud on the frozen ground. His boots crunched over gravel as he jogged to the boy, who had now collapsed into a slow, stumbling crawl. "Hey, hey, son," Elijah called, voice low and warm, the kind of voice trained to calm panic. "You hurt? Can you tell me your name?" The boy looked up, eyes glassy and red, cheeks raw, his lips parted, but no words came at first, just a shaky breath, then a hoarse whisper. My mom. She's hurt. Our car. It crashed." "She's not waking up." Elisha crouched down, heart pounding, not with fear, but urgency. The boy looked fragile. A child trying to hold together a world that had just split open. Elijah gently touched the boy's forehead. It burned with cold and exhaustion. "Okay," he said, calm but firm. "Come inside. Let's get you warm, then you can tell me exactly where she is." The boy nodded, lips trembling, and Elijah scooped him up effortlessly. His arms were strong, but it was the gentleness with which he carried the child that said more. Like he was carrying someone else's whole world. Inside, the house was small but neat. A soft fire crackled in the hearth, and a string of hand-drawn pictures, crayon, stick figures, and stars hung on the fridge. Elijah placed the boy on the worn couch, wrapped him in a fleece blanket, and poured hot cocoa into a chipped mug. The boy clutched it with both hands, the steam curling into his face. Elijah sat across from him, elbows on his knees. "What's your name, son?" "Tyler," the boy whispered. "All right, Tyler, you're safe now. Tell me, where's your mom?" Tyler looked up, eyes wide and wet. "Down the road, near the woods. She was driving fast. We hit a tree. I climbed out the back. She was still in the front seat. I didn't know where to go. But I saw you on the roof." Elijah's hands clenched slightly on his knees. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if warning him. The storm would be here within the hour. Visibility would drop to nothing. It was dangerous, possibly foolish, to go out now. But Tyler's eyes were pleading, innocent, raw, with the kind of desperation that left no room for hesitation. Elijah stood up slowly, reached for the red metal first aid case that sat under the coat rack, and grabbed his thickest jacket. "You sure you remember where she is?" Tyler nodded hard, cocoa sloshing in his mug. "I can show you." "No," Elijah said gently, kneeling to meet his eyes. "You stay here. You're safe. I'll go." The boy gripped the blanket tighter, his lips pressing into a thin line, not wanting to be left, but trusting. Elijah turned toward the door, the wind rattling it like impatient fingers. His fingers paused on the doorknob, just for a second. Then he looked over his shoulder at the boy. "If anything happens," he said softly, "there's a phone on the table. Dial 911. But I'll be back. With your mom." And with that he opened the door and stepped out into the cold. Behind him the fireplace cracked. Outside the snow had begun to fall, not gently but in heavy sheets, like the sky had finally exhaled. And a lone figure moved through it, carrying not just a first aid kit but the weight of a promise he could not afford to break. The snow hit like needles. By the time Elijah stepped off his porch, the world had already begun to disappear. The road ahead, what little of it remained visible, was a white blur, muffled and shifting beneath the storm's breath. Trees that had once stood as quiet sentinels now trembled in protest as wind slammed against their bare limbs. Each step he took was deliberate, boots pressing down through the fast-thickening powder, his coat snapping behind him like a warning flag in a battle no one could win. But Elijah didn't hesitate. There was no time to weigh risks. Somewhere out there, in a twisted wreck of metal and shattered glass, a woman was dying. And inside his home, her son waited with hope too fragile to bear the weight of disappointment. That was enough. That was more than enough. He moved quickly, following Tyler's shaky directions as best he could. Down near the old fence, past the water tower, right by the bend. Elijah had walked that path before, back when weather was kind and the town still believed spring might come again. But now the bend was barely visible, buried beneath snowdrifts that clawed up past his knees. His breath came out in hard bursts, fogging up the inside of his scarf. His fingers ached even through his gloves. The storm didn't care who he was, didn't care that he had once worn the title Chief of Surgery, didn't care that he was a father, a healer, a man trying to do right. It was indifferent. And yet he pushed on. Then he saw it. A dark shape at the edge of the road, almost swallowed by snow. The front end of a black SUV was crumpled around the base of a pine tree, the windshield frosted over, the back door open. Elijah's heart quickened. He stumbled forward, the wind shrieking in his ears. "Ma'am," he shouted, voice barely carrying. "Can you hear me?" No answer. He dropped beside the driver's door and yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The metal had bent in the crash. He cursed under his breath, shifted position, then struck the side window with the heel of his boot. Once, twice, until the glass spidered, then gave way with a brittle crunch. Shards rained down onto the woman slumped inside. She was unconscious, head lolling forward, a thin stream of blood trailing from her temple. Her skin was pale, not just from the cold, but from shock. Her hands were limp at her sides, and the seatbelt had cut hard into her chest. She was alive, but barely. "Elijah," he muttered to himself, breath trembling. "You have maybe 5 minutes." He worked fast. First a quick pulse check, thready but there. Next he reached in, sliced the seatbelt free, and used his coat sleeve to clear the blood from her face. She didn't stir. Gritting his teeth, he lifted her gently, cradling her weight across his shoulder. The snow clawed at his legs, the wind screamed in his ears, and still he moved, step by brutal step, foot dragging through the snow, his back burning from the strain and the cold and the weight of something far heavier than the woman in his arms. Every few yards he had to stop. Not long, just enough to readjust her position, to make sure she was still breathing, to whisper into the wind, "Hold on, just hold on." His words weren't just for her. They were for himself. For Tyler, for a world that needed, somehow, to be reminded that people still risked everything for strangers. As he neared the edge of his neighborhood, the wind began to shift. The storm wasn't over, but something in its rhythm changed. Not quieter, but somehow less violent, as though the sky itself was watching. Elijah staggered up the front steps of his home and kicked the door open with a final burst of strength. Tyler sat on the couch, eyes wide, Coco long forgotten. He gasped when he saw his mother and scrambled to his feet. Elijah laid her gently on the couch, his arms shaking, chest heaving. "She's going to be okay," he said, voice rough but certain. "She's still with us." And then without a word he opened the first aid kit and got to work. Focused, steady, purposeful, his hands moved not with panic but with precision. Each touch measured, each bandage wrapped with care. He didn't speak much, except to reassure Tyler in a voice both calm and commanding. Outside, the storm howled, but inside the little house something had shifted. The fire burned brighter. The silence between breaths held more than fear. It held possibility, redemption, connection. Elijah glanced once at the boy, whose small hands now clutched his mother's. "I found her," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone. "And I brought her home." The fire crackled steadily in the hearth as dusk slid gently into night. Outside, the blizzard continued to dance its wild, merciless waltz across the empty streets of Pine Hollow, blanketing the world in white silence. But inside Elijah's modest living room, the air was thick with warmth and tension, like a held breath waiting for release. The woman had been unconscious for hours. Elijah checked her vitals again, fingers gently pressing against the pulse at her wrist. Still steady, the bleeding had stopped. The bruising around her temple had begun to darken, but her breathing was even now. Tyler hadn't moved far from her side, curled into the corner of the couch, his little hand resting carefully on hers, as if afraid that letting go might break the fragile line tethering her to this world. Elijah sat nearby, body weary, his large frame folded into an old armchair that creaked every time he shifted. He watched them both in silence. Not the kind of silence that fills a room, but the kind that grows inside you when you know something's about to change. The flickering firelight painted soft gold across his dark skin, revealing the lines around his mouth, the heaviness in his eyes, and there was pain there. Long-settled pain, and an unease that hadn't fully left him even after hours of care. He'd done everything he could. The rest was no longer his to control. Then she stirred. It was subtle at first. A twitch of her fingers, a slight shift of her head. Then her eyelids fluttered, and a quiet, rasping inhale escaped her lips. Tyler bolted upright. "Mama?" he whispered, the word catching in his throat. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then settling on the boy's face. She blinked, twice, then her lips parted in recognition. Tyler?" "Yes." Members of the teams type episodes for HSN. Type keywords. The phrase "human torment" begins with Freddy 5. "Bad boy," Teddy laughed. "Good job." The boy nodded furiously, tears springing to his eyes. "You're okay, Mama. She lifted her hand with effort and touched his cheek, her own eyes filling as realization hit like waves. Her voice broke when she spoke again. "We crashed. The road, She looked around, confused. "Where are we?" Elijah stood up, moving into the edge of her view. "You're safe," he said gently, voice deep and warm like molasses. "You're in my home. I found your boy. He brought me to you. You were unconscious. I had to bring you back here to treat you." Her gaze shifted to him slowly. At first there was only gratitude in her face. And then sudden stillness. Her brows furrowed, eyes narrowing slightly. Something flickered in them. Recognition? Disbelief? She squinted harder, as if trying to recall a dream that had slipped just out of reach. "You," she whispered. Elijah tilted his head slightly, cautious. "You're Elijah Brooks." He didn't respond at first, just stared at her with a quiet sort of resignation. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant nod, he confirmed, "Yes, I am. You used to be at St. James Hospital, I remember. My cousin was on the board. You were the chief of surgery." His jaw tensed slightly. "That was a long time ago." There was a pause, long and heavy. The woman sat up a little, her strength returning with every moment, but her eyes never left his. Something deeper churned beneath her gratitude now, something sharper, more curious. "What happened?" she asked, softly but directly. "They said something awful, that you were responsible for a death." Elijah looked down for a moment, gathering the words as if they weighed more than he could carry. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, but laced with something aching. "They said I made a mistake, that I let a man die on the table, but I didn't. He was already too far gone. I did what I could. But that man had power, friends in high places. They needed someone to blame, someone without power to fight back." He met her gaze then, unflinching. "They suspended my license. Media tore me apart. No trial, no appeal. Just the end of everything I'd built." Her face softened, her lips parted, a slow breath escaping. There was no disbelief in her eyes now, only realization. And something else. Remorse. "And you left the city," she murmured. He nodded. "Came here with my daughter, started over, quietly, no headlines, no eyes watching, judging, just people who needed care and couldn't afford to beg for it." She looked around the room now, really looked, at the faded wallpaper, the old furniture, the drawings on the fridge, the worn edges of a life lived with dignity and restraint. Then her voice changed, gentler but firm. "You saved my life tonight, and my son's." Elijah shrugged slightly. "That's what I do, or try to." The woman sat back against the cushion, her eyes still fixed on him, now filled with something new. Determination. "My name is Jasmine Whitehead," she said, slowly and clearly, "and I don't forget what people do for me." Elijah offered a faint, tired smile. "You don't owe me anything." "But," she shook her head, "we'll see." The snow began to melt 3 days later. By then Jasmine had already returned to the city, her mind a flurry of names, dates, and questions that had haunted her ever since she'd left Elijah's small house behind. She didn't sleep much, not because of the pain from her injuries, which had faded, but because of something far more persistent. The memory of his voice, calm and steady, the way his hands moved with precision even in the chaos, and the truth in his eyes when he spoke of betrayal. In her penthouse office overlooking the skyline, Jasmine sat in silence, the walls around her gleaming with modern art, glass, and steel. Her assistant brought in files and coffee, but she barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on one thing. She opened her laptop and typed in Elijah Brooks' malpractice case. It was worse than she remembered. News headlines from years ago screamed his name, attaching it to failure, scandal, disgrace. But the articles read more like opinion pieces than fact. Her cousin, the one who had served on the board of St. James, had once mentioned the case but had spoken in half-truths, vague murmurs, like people do when they want to believe a lie without being held responsible for repeating it. Jasmine wasn't the kind of woman who could ignore things once she knew they didn't sit right. That's what had made her a billionaire. She asked questions until there were no more. She dug where others stopped. And this was personal now. She called in a private investigator, a woman she trusted, discreet, sharp. Within a week, Jasmine had a stack of documents on her desk, suppressed statements, altered timelines, conflicting testimonies. One former nurse even admitted in a recorded interview that she'd been pressured to sign a report that didn't match what she'd seen. The truth had been buried, deliberately. Elijah had been silenced, not because he had erred, but because he had stood in the way of a legacy family protecting its reputation. An outsider made a convenient scapegoat in a system that still bowed to wealth over truth. Jasmine closed the folder slowly, her jaw set. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, but she did pick up the phone and schedule a meeting with the legal team she used for her foundations. People who didn't ask why when she said, "I want to clear someone's name." In the weeks that followed, things began to shift. Old records were reopened. Quiet inquiries became louder. The same media that once printed damning headlines now began whispering about a miscarriage of justice, about new evidence. And at the center of it all, Elijah's name slowly began to rise again. Not in scandal, but in sympathy. Then, in admiration. Jasmine didn't stop there. She returned to Pine Hollow herself, this time not with a limp or a bandage, but with a purpose as solid as the winter air that still lingered in the cracks of the earth. Elijah was outside, clearing branches from the side of the clinic when she pulled up in a sleek, dark SUV. He looked up, brow lifting slightly as she stepped out. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said, wiping his hands on a towel slung over his shoulder. She smiled, not the polished kind she wore in boardrooms, but something warmer. "I told you," she said. "I don't forget." She handed him a thick envelope. He opened it with cautious hands, eyes scanning the legal summary. His name cleared. Officially. His lips parted, but no words came. He just stared at the paper, then at her, disbelief softening into something like relief. "Like the beginning of peace." "Thanks. More than I ever asked for," he said finally. "You didn't ask," Jasmine replied. "That's why it matters." She reached into her coat and pulled out a second envelope. This one thinner. Inside were two offers, typed and signed. One offered him a position as her personal physician with a full staff, flexible hours, and a six-figure salary. The other was a leadership role at a new medical center her company was launching, a place where he could rebuild everything. But Elijah didn't even glance at the papers. His eyes never left hers. "I appreciate it," he said, quietly but firmly. "Truly. But I'm needed here. These people, they don't have another doctor. They barely have clean gauze. I can't walk away." Jasmine studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "Then I want to see what you've built. All of it. Show me." He didn't hesitate. He led her inside the small building, with its peeling linoleum floors and second-hand equipment, the exam room with mismatched chairs and the cabinet held shut with duct tape. He showed her where he taught kids CPR on mannequins made from water jugs, and where he stored antibiotics in a mini-fridge with a busted light. And Jasmine Whitehead, who had eaten at white tablecloth banquets with senators and CEOs, stood in that humble space, arms crossed over her designer coat, and didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was thick. "You've done more with nothing than most doctors do with everything." He shrugged. "They don't need everything, just someone who sees them." She nodded slowly. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Start putting together a design team," she said. "We're upgrading this clinic, full funding, and I want to create a foundation. His name goes on it." Elijah shook his head slightly, overwhelmed. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, eyes locked on his. "But I want to." And just like that, the promise was made. Spring didn't arrive all at once in Pine Hollow. It crept in slowly, as if afraid to disturb what winter had left behind. But the day the new clinic opened, the sun shone as if it had been waiting for this moment. The snow had melted into soft mud around the edges of the road, and children ran with coats half-zipped, their laughter echoing against freshly painted walls. Where once there had been a sagging roof and flickering lights, there now stood a clean, modern building trimmed in soft greens and warm wood. The windows were large and full of light, and above the front doors hung a sign carved into metal: Brooks Community Health Center, in partnership with the Whitehead Foundation. Inside, the space breathed life. Exam rooms were equipped with brand-new monitors, sterile counters, and stocked shelves. A small classroom near the back held CPR dummies and whiteboards, ready for the next generation to learn what to do when the world goes quiet and someone needs saving. Elijah stood in the center of it all, wearing the same worn boots but a new coat, gifted by a patient who had sewn it by hand. He shook hands with elderly farmers, mothers carrying babies, teenagers in school jackets. He greeted each one by name. Jasmine arrived just after noon, dressed in a simple navy suit, no entourage. She walked through the entrance with Tyler beside her, the boy's face now bright and curious, his steps light. Elijah saw them and smiled, not the small, guarded smile he used to offer, but a full, genuine one that softened the hard lines of his face. He crossed the room and held out his hand. Jasmine took it but then surprised him by pulling him into a brief hug. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's needed," he replied. They stood for a moment, surrounded by the hum of voices and movement. "I heard what you've been doing," Jasmine said. "Teaching people how to stitch wounds, showing them how to check vitals. You've created something more than care. You've created knowledge." Elijah looked around, not at the walls or the new equipment, but at the people. "This community saved me long before I saved anyone else. They gave me a second chance when no one else would." Tyler tugged gently at Jasmine's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, "can I come volunteer this summer?" Jasmine looked down at him, then to Elijah, who nodded slowly, his voice warm. "We'd be lucky to have you." The grand opening turned into something quieter, a gathering, not a ceremony. There were no speeches, no camera crews, just neighbors walking through the clinic with wide eyes, touching the clean surfaces and whispering to one another. "It doesn't feel like a miracle, but maybe it is." Later, as the sun dipped below the hills and cast long golden shadows through the windows, Elijah and Jasmine sat outside on the clinic's small front bench. "I always thought," Elijah began, "that the best I could hope for was to fade out quietly, not with bitterness, but with peace. What I never expected was this." Jasmine looked at him, eyes steady. "You gave without asking. That's what made you unforgettable. People like you don't fade, Elijah. You multiply." He chuckled softly, then sighed, a deep breath that seemed to release something old from his chest. "I'm still not sure how to thank you." "You don't," she said. "Just keep doing what you do." Above them, the new sign caught the last of the light. Inside, nurses and volunteers began closing up, laughing softly as they prepared for the next day. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to sit still, to feel the warmth in the air, and to know that something small and good had changed. Permanently. Because sometimes the fairy tale isn't in the palace or the prince. Sometimes it's in a weathered town, a man who refused to stop healing, and a woman who decided that justice wasn't just a word, it was a responsibility. Years later, children in Pine Hollow would grow up knowing how to save a life, and they would all know the name Elijah Brooks, not because he once lost everything, but because he gave everything back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.